Counselling Psychology is a discipline that is looking at supporting the psychological and emotional well-being of individuals, that sits alongside other professions like psychiatry and clinical psychology. I think one of the main differences for counselling psychology is really that it isn't quite so embedded in the medical model, so really sort of viewing sort of people from that more medicalised position, and adopts a very humanistic position towards psychology. So it's embedded within the humanistic psychology movement, where the individual is viewed as someone who has the capacity within themselves to grow and to develop without necessarily the need for outside interventions. The other components to humanistic psychology are really thinking about the uniqueness of the individual as well. So psychologists traditionally have an interest in breaking people apart. So really thinking about the different components that make the human. So we like to say that they're depressed or they're anxious or have certain personality types. Whereas I think humanistically oriented counselling psychologists commonly like to view the whole of the person. So there's a very famous story of some blind men who are asked to identify an object in front of them. And the first person goes to the object and touches the object, and he sort of finds this wiggly kind of thing, and he identifies it as a snake. The second person goes along and identifies this hard kind of object and identifies it as a spear. And these people keep going along and they identify different objects. And it's only when all of the information is put together that they recognise that actually it's an elephant. And it's almost that in taking and deconstructing the object into all these different components, they missed the essence of what the object was. So from a counselling psychology perspective, I think we're always trying to hold the whole person in mind when we're working therapeutically with them, rather than necessarily treating a particular symptomology that they may be presenting with. And another area of the humanistic position is really valuing the idea that people also have a choice in the world that they're living in. So that every person is intentional and that they will be working towards their own goals and have their own desires that they wish to achieve within their life. And the therapist's role commonly becomes trying to support the person in understanding that they can become the author in their own story. And this is often quite different to the kind of more typical psychological position, where I think the therapist is often viewed as the hero of the story. So someone who has a problem will go to a therapist and seek support, and they will be the kind of the person who helps them through things. Rather, in a counselling psychology or a humanistic position, it's really that the client would be the hero of the story. And it's really trying to tap into their resources for them to help themselves. So, and this is quite different as well to the kind of framework that health services typically take. Taking a quite medicalised position, theoretical counselling psychologists or psychologists would typically use particular therapeutic theory and therapeutic approaches. Such as, I suppose, historically, things like psychoanalysis, so Freudian psychoanalysis, and developments around behaviourism, where they may be deconstructed to particular tools that therapists work with. And rather, at the heart of the work of a counselling psychologist, I think really there's the valuing of the relationship itself. So although I think the psychoanalysis and all these therapeutic theories build together to inform the work that therapists are doing, at the heart is really thinking about developing a really strong relationship that enables an individual or provides a fertile environment for that person to grow and to develop. Probably the most influential humanistic psychologist in this area was Carl Rogers, who talked about developing a relationship that in which the therapist provides an environment where you're congruent with the person who you're working with. You're empathic, so you're trying to understand the world from their own position. And you're non-judgmental, so you're accepting of the kind of issues that someone is presenting with, to try and create a trusting, warm environment for that person to actually explore the difficulties that they're finding at that point in time. And in adopting these type of approaches, I think often counselling psychologists also try to embrace or understand some of the power relationships that go on within those type of therapeutic work. The therapist's role would be to create a warm and accepting, fertile environment for that person to explore the complexities that they're encountering within their life. And that sort of brings with it sort of an exploration of the power relationships within the therapeutic work as well. So really thinking that the therapist is in a very powerful position. Commonly people present or come to counselling in a relatively vulnerable position. And so being mindful of being able to create that warm, facilitative environment in which someone may not feel that the therapist is going to tell them what to do becomes very important to counselling psychologists. And in sort of adopting this position that is really kind of embracing the idea that people can grow, that they have choices within their world, and it sort of counters some of the typical psychological frame in which I think we commonly view people as having problems and then they will be resolved by the therapist. And this creates a sort of a conflict between the kind of position that research has now got within the work of psychologists. So empiricism and empirical research often frame and direct the policies that I think organisations make in terms of how psychological care will be delivered. And those frameworks are commonly based upon quantitative research methods such as randomised controlled trials. And although counselling psychologists don't want to discount that type of evidence, it becomes incredibly important in terms of our decision making and making ethical decisions to support people. I think there's a challenging that it's the only type of evidence that people can utilise. So that the position that I would advocate would be more about being research informed or informed by research rather than driven by research, which seems to be a position that when you ask therapists what it is that informs how they work, seems to be more reflective of the real world situation. So commonly if people are asked what it is that influences them, they will say it may be the client that they've been working with, or it might be their own personal history, rather than necessarily a particular adherence to, or strict adherence to a particular psychological framework. So that sort of combination of really valuing the theory and being informed by the theory and valuing the research, but being informed by the research creates a complex kind of decision-making process rather than necessarily a simple one where a person has a particular diagnosis and this response will cure them. I think it often becomes a much more creative and responsive human-to-human endeavour. And that creativity and flexibility becomes an important part of the work that a counselling psychologist would undertake with someone. The two frames, I guess, that you might consider these in are really thinking, the they're commonly described as either the scientist-practitioner framework, so the one that's very informed by science and informed by research, and maybe the reflective practitioner side. So the reflective practitioner side, unlike the side which is maybe dictated or dominated by research, is really the area of the therapist's work that's influenced by themselves and their use of themselves as a tool. So typically a counselling psychologist would not only understand the theory and research that they may be utilising, but they would also undertake personal therapy themselves, and they would engage in clinical supervision. And clinical supervision is commonly, or it might crudely be viewed as a form of therapy for therapists. So when an individual is working with people who might be very seriously distressed, clinical supervision can be a very useful space for the therapist to talk about how they are responding to or their own personal responses to hearing all of this trauma or whatever kind of presenting issues people come with. So I guess to summarise, in terms of the key bits that I would flag up, I think counselling psychology and counselling psychologists' use of theory is often really embedded within that humanistic framework that's maybe challenging the more medical model side of psychology, or emphasis that gets placed on in psychology, and the valuing of the therapeutic relationship, and really creating a strong relationship for complex and hard conversations to be had, alongside this almost willingness to understand oneself as a therapist. Carl Rogers talked about the idea of therapeutic work being a way of being, and I think commonly a lot of therapists and counselling psychologists would resonate with that as an idea, in the sense that I may be working as a professional counselling psychologist, but lots of the ideas and concepts that are valuable to me would also be parts of my everyday life as well.